When it comes to delivering flowers for life's special occasions, trust the name that's been setting the standard for nearly 50 years. 1-800-Flowers.com. From breathtaking bouquets to one-of-a-kind arrangements, 1-800-Flowers is your authority on quality blooms. Always fresh, always stunning, always delivered with care. And right now, for a limited time, you can save up to 40% off your bouquet and make someone's day. Save up to 40% off today at 1-800-Flowers.com/podcast. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/podcast.
Hey listeners, this is Peter, and welcome back to the History Shorts podcast. Today's conversation series episode is brought to you by thecollector.com. If you're into mind-blowing dives into ancient history, philosophy, killer art breakdowns, or even epic travel spots with a cultural twist, this is the site that's got it all. Visit thecollector.com. Stories to teach, inform, and inspire. Today on History Shorts, I'm thrilled to be joined by William Dalrymple, one of the world's leading historians and storytellers of India and the wider South Asian world. Over the years, William has brought to life empires, trade networks, and the vibrant cultural histories of a region often misunderstood or overlooked. His latest book, The Golden Road, explores India's centuries-old coastal trading networks, uncovering the human stories, cultural exchanges, and global connections that shaped not just the subcontinent, but the wider world as well. In today's conversation, we'll journey along these historic shores, examine the fascinating interplay of commerce, culture, and empire, and discover what lessons the past holds for our increasingly interconnected world. For past episodes in the conversation series, please visit www.historyshortspodcast.com. And if you like this show, please consider becoming a monthly Patreon supporter at patreon.com/History Shorts Podcast. Enjoy today's conversation.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941,
it's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Will, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
A great pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
So let's start with your journey to becoming a historian and being interested in history. Is this something from your childhood?
It actually was. It was the thing I've always been interested in since I was really very small. History and archaeology, and in my childhood, it was more archaeology, ancient history. The very first time I left Scotland, I was born and brought up near Edinburgh, was to go and visit the Tutankhamun exhibition, which my indulgent parents took me to see in London. And I remember seeing London for the first time. But the reason to go was to see Tutankhamun. And then when I was at school, I used to just bicycle around, writing about all the monuments in the vicinity. And then when I left school, the first thing I wanted to do was go and I got sort of excited by all that sort of Agatha Christie world of sort of digging in the Middle East, and sort of I sort of dreamt of discovering Assyrian bulls in the kind of in the sand dunes, this sort of stuff. So I got a place at the British School of Archaeology in Baghdad, and thank God British Saddam Hussein closed it down. Otherwise, I'd probably still be there. And anyway, I ended up going through a series of accidents to India, and have lived all my adult life in India, and have written now, I think, 10 books on Indian history.
So what was the impetus for this latest one, The Golden Road? Is this something that you always wanted to get to and research?
To that early love of early history, because most of my adult life has actually been spent writing about the colonial period. And the last 25 years, I've spent writing 4 big fat books on India under the East India Company, which is this extraordinary story of how India got taken over by a corporation. We always think about the British, as far as we think about it at all, about the British Raj, and as if it's a kind of state enterprise, but it wasn't. India was conquered by a multinational corporation like, Meta or Facebook, called the East India Company, that was subcontracted by the British government to run its affairs with not just India, but the whole of the East, anything east of Cape of Good Hope. And this bizarre story whereby a corporation run for profit by shareholders end up controlling what was then the richest country in the world. India controlled, during the Mughal Empire in the kind of 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, a quarter of the world's production. It was not sometimes today people think of India as a poor country and not as an incredibly rich country. But through most of history, India and China have been the world's two richest lands. And the reason the British and the French and the Portuguese and the Dutch all went to India was because it was so incredibly rich. And yet, the East India Company, founded the year that Shakespeare wrote Macbeth and Julius Caesar, 1600, 1599, in a country which at that point only controlled about 3% of the world's GDP, ends up over a period of nearly a century taking over this incredibly rich country. They arrive at a time when the Mughal Empire is breaking up, and by the end of the 18th century, not only is India controlled by this corporation, but the corporation, the East India Company, has an army twice the size of the British Army. The British Army's got 100,000 troops ready to take on Napoleon in 1799. At the same time, the East India Company has 200,000 troops. It's a bizarre story. Anyway, I spent the last 30 years writing that. And then, in the sense, this is rather a treat, doing all the stuff that I've always been really interested in. And it's a lot of archaeology and art history. And it's the story of, in a sense, the backstory of that, how India became so rich, how India was so incredibly prosperous, and how its civilization was so remarkable. And it's the story of ancient India. The Golden Road is, in a sense, an alternative to the Silk Road. We're very familiar with this concept of the Silk Road, which is something that is very familiar to us from exhibitions, from geopolitics. The whole idea of the Chinese Belt and Road and so on is built on top of it. But in the classical period, there's no question that it was not China that was the biggest trading partner of Rome. In fact, Rome had only the very vaguest idea of where China was. But every year from Rome and Egypt, trading fleets left of 250 vessels that sailed using the monsoon winds, not over land, not using sort of camel caravans and so on, but through the turbocharged winds of the monsoon, these enormous winds which sailors learnt to harness, and which helpfully reverse themselves twice a year. So as in autumn the winds are blowing outwards, it's all to do with the Tibetan plateau. As Tibet freezes in winter, winds blow in and rake into the cold Himalayan mountains, and then as it thaws in summer, blows out again. And that means that if you're an Indian sailor, you've only got to put up a sail, and once you've learnt, like a surfer, to harness those great winds and not just get sunk by them, you can get to the Roman Empire in just 6 weeks. Set sail from the west coast. And then you've got sort of, a few months to sell your goods in Alexandria, go and see the pyramids, see a show, and so on, and then come back again. And you can do the whole round trip in a year. So India was not this distant land unknown to the Roman Empire. It was the nearest and biggest trading partner. And those trade routes, which Roman sailors used and Indian sailors used, brought Indian civilization in two directions. First of all, westwards, and we get Indian ideas like the numbers we use and zero, ideas that we don't often associate with India, because we've come to call the Indian numbers Arabic numbers, which is where the Europeans actually got them from immediately, but that they originated in India. But then there's other ideas like the whole world of Buddhism and so on, which spreads right across Asia, and later the ideas of Sanskrit and Hindu civilization, which again spreads right through Southeast Asia. So that the largest Hindu temple in the world is not in India, but in Angkor Wat in Cambodia. So there's a whole world which we're not very familiar with. It's not part of our curriculum in the West. No one teaches us this. We know the names of, for example, Greek mathematicians taught us. We know about Archimedes and Pythagoras. Even when we're in our short trousers. But no one teaches us about the man who invented zero, the guy called Brahmagupta, or Aryabhatta, who worked out the exact circumference of the Earth, worked out the distance from the Earth to the Moon, worked out that we lived in a heliocentric universe 1,000 years before Galileo. These guys just don't feature on our radar at all. And so it was great fun to spend 5 years diving into this extraordinary world, which is so unfamiliar to most of us.
You touched upon a few of these, but what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you felt like you wanted to correct within this book?
So I suppose the biggest misconception was this idea of the Silk Road. In the classical period, which is what I'm dealing with, which is the period of the Roman Empire and right up to about the 12th century, um, the Silk Road really was not it existed as something. You get goods moving from hand to hand over many decades. They might eventually get to China, or a Chinese piece of silk might get to Rome, but there's no direct trade routes at this period. But the open oceans are absolutely there. And if you track, as Oxford University did last year, coin hoards for Roman coins, the best way of working out where Roman trade went. And you, of course, it goes all over the Roman Empire. You see it in France and Spain and Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean. But there's no line of gold passing horizontally to the Chinese South China Sea. And in fact, there is no Roman coins at all ever discovered in China, because it just didn't figure on the trade networks at that time. But if the country whose museums have the most Roman coins outside the Roman Empire is India and Sri Lanka. And they're there in their hundreds. And why? Because Romans went there to buy pepper, to buy ivory, to hunt wild animals for the circuses. And if you go to a wonderful site called Piazza Armerina in Sicily, which I actually went and saw a fortnight ago, there are pictures of Roman tiger hunts to find these animals, to let loose on gladiators. Russell Crowe doing his stuff. A tiger, you have to go and get it. You can't just sort of buy it in the market in Rome. They don't just turn up. You have to go and get them. And the Romans did. And this was a major item of trade with the Roman Empire. And then there is perfumes and silk. In actual fact, according to Roman trading manuals, they didn't buy silk from China because they didn't know where China was. They bought it through India, through the ports of the west coast of India. And all these things were expensive luxuries. And Pliny, the Roman writer who died during the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, he talks about India as the drain of all the precious metals of the world. And he rants about how the Romans are spending money on what he regards as a sort of woke spice, which is pepper, sort of thing only the metropolitan elite would put on their food. And he complains about how Roman women are turning up almost naked at parties in these see-through silks. And Strabo, another Roman author, talks about these enormous fleets that used to set sail from the Red Sea coast every year with the monsoon. So these are things that are really well documented, and yet and scholars know about. If you talk to scholars who study these things, it's very familiar. But somehow it hasn't made it into popular consciousness at all. There is absolutely no concept that Rome and India had any idea of each other's existence, but that's absolutely not the case.
Since 2011, American Giant has been making everyday clothing with extraordinary effort. Not in far-off factories, but right here in the USA. We obsess over fabrics, fit, and details, because if you're going to wear it every day, it should feel great and last for years. From the cut of a hoodie to the finishing of a seam, nothing is overlooked. Our supply chain is tight-knit and local, which means less crisscrossing the country and more care in every step. The result is durable clothing, t-shirts, hoodies, sweatpants, and denim that become part of your life season after season. This isn't fast fashion, it's clothing made with purpose by people who care as much about how it's made as how it fits. Get 20% off your first order with code STAPLE20 at American-Giant.com. That's 20% off your first order at American-Giant.com with code STAPLE20.
The spread of Buddhism and Hinduism to Southeast Asia and China is definitely a central theme. What role did merchants and pilgrims play in this soft power projection? And how does that contrast with with the more known militaristic expansions that you often study in history?
Very, very good point, Peter. The spread of Christianity, to South America with the conquistadors and so on, obviously took place at the barrel of a conquistador's gun. And Islam famously spreads by the sword in the 7th and 8th centuries. But Buddhism spreads along trade routes and spreads not just to, first to Sri Lanka, but then up to Pakistan, Afghanistan, through Lhasa to Tibet, Mongolia and Siberia ultimately, through China to Korea and Japan, then down to Southeast Asia through countries today like Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, even the Philippines. And it does it without a shot being fired, without an arrow being loosed, without a spear being thrown. And it's merchants that are traveling and bringing these things. And also surprising, I think, is that, today we sometimes think in Buddhism as a very otherworldly religion when it's shown in Hollywood. They're sort of like Marvel superheroes. They're sort of floating off the ground, levitating, this sort of stuff. In reality, of course, Buddhism exists in the real world, and it does, like anyone in the real world. It's involved in business matters, and you find that the early Buddhist monasteries are lending money, that they're employing slaves, that the nuns are making cloth with cotton, and that they're crucially, they're lending money to the merchants. And we have all these inscriptions saying, so and so, the merchant repaid a loan of 500 gold coins to the monastery of such so and so on the coast of India, and hereby here's the donation plus interest, which they're and this is how it spread. The monasteries are not just spiritual places, but they are banks and caravanserais where merchants stay. And this is a major world revolution that, again, are totally absent from our curriculum. We just don't read about this stuff in school or college. But through these peaceful means, through trade, Buddhism, in a matter of 300 or 400 years, spreads right across Asia and remains, in the lifeblood of countries like Japan and Burma and Vietnam, and absolutely changed the way they look at the world. And with them come Indian languages, Indian conceptions of the world, Indian ideas of geography and astronomy and astrology and so on. And it's arguably the greatest soft power revolution, the greatest transformation of human thought, not by arms or politics, but by just the sheer sophistication of these ideas.
Why do you think this Indo-centric perspective has been so overlooked in Western historiography?
I think many Indians would probably say that it's the fault of the British and colonialism, that if you're going to conquer a place, you can't really admit that they were civilized 2,000 years before you stopped wearing bearskins and painting yourself with woad, because you're claiming to bring civilization to these people. So I think the attitudes of Lord Macaulay, who kind of, in a sense, encapsulated the attitudes of the Imperial British, with his famous minute of education saying the single shelf of a good English library is worth the entire native literature of India and Arabia. These sort of attitudes have led to the downgrading in our heads and in our curriculums of Indian thought. So as I said, we learn about Archimedes and Pythagoras, but we just don't learn about their Indian equivalents. So in a sense, they're more important to us because the numbers we use every day, the numbers on the computer in front of you, the numbers on your cell phone, the numbers that we use to calculate, these are an Indian invention. They're not there. We were using Latin numbers, MCV, CCX, all that sort of stuff. Try giving even your phone number to your girlfriend with the Latin numbers. It takes about half an hour. But there's this simple Indian conception of 9 numerals plus 0, which allows you then to do place value, tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, which opens the door to high mathematics like algebra and binary and algorithms, all this sort of stuff. These are Indian inventions, and the 0 comes originally from Indian philosophy, from this idea of sunya, the void, which is a central concept in Buddhism and Hinduism. So we owe a lot to India without realizing it, and we think of civilization as something which really sort of starts with Greece and develops through Rome and spreads through Western Europe, forgetting that half of humanity looks to India as the center of civilization. And you have these Chinese monks, like the great traveling monk Xuanzang, saying that the country in the world that everyone most admires is India. And you look at that and you think, whoa. We think about Greece, or maybe, if not Greece, we think about China. But India doesn't play that role in the West, and somehow has got left out of the picture.
As you're doing this research, I assume you're coming across people that are probably very excited that you are doing this research, that have been waiting for someone to be that voice. Do you see a paradigm shift of India maybe creeping into the broader narrative?
Well, India is somewhere that, when I was young, we thought of as a very poor country, but it's now the 5th biggest economy in the world. And by the end of the next decade, it's going to be the 3rd biggest. It's going to overtake Germany and Japan by the end of this decade. And this is not some freak development of some unexpected sort of astonishing thing that's happened in the 21st century. This is just India and China before it returning to their natural place in the world. It's always been the way that India and China have been the two biggest economies. And this is just India recovering after 300 years of colonialism, with all the riches of India shipped out of India to Britain. When you go to Britain, you see one of those gorgeous National Trust houses with sort of Colin Firth striding in front of them in breeches from some masterpiece theatre show. Those chances are that they came either from slavery if they're on the west coast of India, or they came from looting India if they're on the east coast. And it's worth remembering that, well, England, but particularly my country, Scotland, were some of the poorer countries in Europe as late as sort of 1700. The rich countries were Spain and Portugal, rich with the loot of the New World, but also Italy and Britain was quite far down the pecking order. And then two things happened, and one is slavery and the Caribbean slave plantations, and the whole Middle Passage and the shameful story of slavery. And the other is the East India Company and its diversion of the wealth of India into British pockets, which it does very successfully for 200 years. And that's not, some sort of woke rewriting of history. It's simple economic fact. It is India was the richest country in the world, and its wealth got diverted by the East India Company. With some of these young East India Company men shipping home £1 million at the end, by the time they're 30, and then going off and retiring, becoming MPs and so on. But in the 18th century, that was quite common. And this money comes from India. And as Lord Curzon, the most famous of the British viceroys of India, said, would take away India, and Britain just becomes a medium-sized power like Belgium. There's truth in that. Painful for the Brits, but there you go.
Wow. Well, what are you working on next? I assume right now you're in the thick of promoting this book.
I am.
But are you already like, hey, I'm already working on something else, or I got my eye on anything else?
Well, I have to say I've been very affected, like many people in the world, by what's going on in Gaza and the plight of the Palestinians. And there are many wonderful books about the Jewish people and about Jerusalem and so on. And many of my friends have written beautifully about that. But there's no book on the history of the Palestinians. And the history of the Palestinians has, in a sense, been erased. Golda Meir famously said there is no such thing as the Palestinians. In fact, wow. You can find the first reference to Palestinians on a wall of a temple in Egypt, Medinat Habu, dating from 1400 BCE. The Assyrians talk about the Palashtu, 800 BCE, and the Greeks, Herodotus, talks about Syria Palestina in 600 BCE. So this word, this place name, has a long history, and there've been a people associated with it. And I think that this is a very important moment to quietly, not in a ranty way, but to quietly
provide context to the world,
context to this very painful story, and to write this. There literally is very difficult to read a history of this place name, which is one of the oldest place names in the world.
Where does one go to do that research? Like, where does your research taking you?
Whoa, that's going to be quite something, all over the Middle East. Short answer. Yeah. But also, some of the crucial moments, again, stories associated with British colonialism, because it was the British mandate that led to the birth of the State of Israel and the great disaster for the Palestinians in 1948, which was also the great moment for the Jewish people when the State of Israel was created. And so you have to look through both ends of the telescope. What was a catastrophe for one people was a moment of rebirth and exhilaration for the other. But both those stories need telling, I think, and we can't understand it. It needs to be a crucial mission. Very few of us know this history. I certainly didn't know that the ancient Egyptians were talking about the Palestinians until lately. And there's a whole world of history to be rediscovered, and amazing stories about, for example, I actually have a podcast myself called the Empire Pod, and we're doing at the moment a 12-hour history of Gaza. And some of the stories there, I I had no idea that Gaza had a university at the time of the Byzantine Empire and a school of rhetoric that was the rival of the School of Alexandria. At the same time, it was famous for its sort of Dionysiac literary festivals where people People recited literary poems that was it was like an erotic literary festival in Gaza. That's not what we associate with that part of the world.
Yeah.
And then the whole story of how Palestine remained Christian right up until the Crusades in the 12th century. It was majority Christian until 1200. And then again, the later stories about the Mamluks and the Mongols and the Ottomans. These are fascinating periods of history, and Gaza is, for much of that, the main port on that coast.
Yeah, you brought up something really interesting too. Like, as historians, people sometimes ask, like, why are you doing this episode of the podcast? So why are you writing this book? Because I'm actually genuinely curious myself.
Yeah.
Like that's how it comes, right?
You and I know that if you want to understand where you are in history, you have to study the history of a place to place yourself. It's like having a roadmap. And if you're wandering around hiking in the woods somewhere, you need a map, or else you don't know where you are. You get lost. And the same is true, I think, very much of history. Unless you understand where people came from, you can't understand the world around you. That's my next project. It's obviously very controversial, but I think it's really important too.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. But this was a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
I'm really, really grateful.